Okay, right. I am going to get started for today. For those who don't know me, my name's Mel Glazard. I work as a specialist for education in the UK. Predominantly, sorry, my work is across the region in the Midlands and the Birmingham, Worcester area. But it does see me go a little bit further as well. A large part of my role is as an English specialist. So the various webinars that I've hosted so far have been very much English related. Now, today's session, we're going to be looking at the power of storytelling and how we bring those stories to life. So during the course of the session, it's going to be roughly about an hour. Part of that will be research based to share with you, but we will also be looking at tangible strategies that you can use in your own practice within your own educational setting. So by the end of today's session, the aim will have been to have shared with you the research behind storytelling. A lot of that goes on. And the impact that storytelling has to increase language comprehension skills with learners. We're going to look at that intended impact of sharing stories, what that can mean for your pupils. I'm going to be sharing with you quite a lot of research behind the reading for pleasure pedagogy. In more recent years, this has been pretty prominent in the UK to see what impact it actually has. So I'm going to be sharing some of that information with you and how you can instill that reading for pleasure pedagogy within your own setting. We're going to be looking within that as well, the reading for pleasure pedagogy, how you create a reading community, a reading culture in your school. Then we'll be looking at the art of powerful storytelling, what that actually looks like in practice, which is where I will share some strategies with you. And as it says here, the key strategies that will bring that story to life. During the course of the session as well, you'll have ample time to reflect on your own practice. So let's get started. Okay, I often refer to this simple view of reading. If any of you were logged into one of my earlier sessions, this is the simple view of reading. Now, if we look at it in terms of strategy, pupils that have had little or no phonic teaching input or little or no story time, so nobody has read to them growing up, would generally come into this quartile here, in that they would have poor word recognition and poor comprehension. They haven't been exposed to that vocabulary to understand the meaning of various words. If we look to the top quartile here, this would be a learner, a pupil, who has embarked upon systematic synthetic phonic teaching. So they're having regular phonic teaching on a daily basis, which means that they've got good word recognition. However, they've got little or poor language comprehension. And the pupils that fall in here generally are not read to very frequently. So they're not introduced to literature that's above their understanding to extend them further. Down here in the right corner, these would be pupils where they started and they'd had no phonic input and no story time. They would gradually move along this line here into a good level of comprehension because they've listened to stories on a daily basis, they've been introduced to new vocabulary, and they've engaged in quality book talk to establish their understanding. So they're starting to get used to the story systems, the recall, the structures of the piece, new vocabulary, and then making connections. However, they've had little or no little or no input in terms of phonic teaching, which would mean, because of that, they've got poor word recognition. But what we want is a balance of both the phonic teaching and the story time, so that we're pushing our pupils into this top quartile here, where they've got good word recognition and good language comprehension. Now, storytelling and shared reading have consistently been shown to improve that language, okay? And it moves them into this quartile here. Story shared need to be at or above the language comprehension of that learner, so that they can make connection, but also to extend them further. And story, that we're going to be looking at today, we need to use that as a vehicle to extend our learners' language comprehension. So, what are the benefits of reading aloud? I've shared this one before, but it's so very true, and it really does have an impact. It says, did you know that being read to is the most powerful predictor of a learner's future reading comprehension? By reading aloud to a learner every day, you are fusing the act of reading with comfort and love. When you love a book, your learner will want to hear it again and again. We're wired to thrive on repetition. So when you've read a story like a Brown Brown Bear, What Do You See, for the 100th time with your learners, remember that you are hardwiring their brains for success. So I'm going to share with you this afternoon some research by the Education Endowment Foundation. They carried out some teacher choice trials in the UK, and they ran surveys, and they found out the following things. They were trying to measure the impact of story on pupils' attainment. They found that in most primary school settings, the teachers do actually read aloud to their pupils, and they do that on a regular basis. They found that in some classrooms, the teacher will read the text aloud without really pausing. And the aim of that, when they unpicked it further, was to immerse the class just fully in the story. They weren't analysing it. They weren't necessarily checking their comprehension and understanding and tasking them with lots and lots of questions. They were just allowing them to fully immerse. What they did find in other classrooms is that teachers will often pause. So they'll be sharing whichever story it is with the child, but at regular intervals, they'll just stop, pause, and prompt the child for their responses. Now, it might be through questions, but as simple as thinking aloud a question. Oh, I wonder what that word means there. That's new. We've not come across that before. So there's quite a variance between classroom practice. But what we need to think about really is which model actually works best. Take a little time now and jot down your own thoughts. Which of those two models works best? Is it fully immersing them and that you don't stop and you don't pause? Is it pausing at intervals and asking them lots of questions? Could it be somewhere in between the two? So that during the course of the week, actually, we expose the pupils to both. Just jot down what you think. As it stands, there's no measurable impact in difference between these two strategies. So for myself as a practitioner, I think there needs to be a fine balance between the two. And I'm hoping, well, it will, by the end of today's session, I will have shared a strategy with you whereby you fully immerse them here. But then I think in the ideal model, once you've done that full immersion, that we move on to the second one here, where we're prompting and thinking about these things with the children and promoting that quality book talk. So they carried out a survey, And when they ran that survey, these were the views of a number of teachers across the UK within the research schools. They suggested that actually reading aloud is a communal, social and enjoyable act that serves as a way of uniting the class together as a community. Not rushing it at the end of the day and then sending them out of the classroom door, but actually building in that quality time to come together and to share books that they love. Sometimes books that they don't like, and that's absolutely fine because we're promoting that discussion. We're getting them to rationalise why they do or they don't like something. So they felt that it acted as a community, united them together. The teachers that were questioned also felt that actually reading aloud and asking those questions helped the children to improve their own reading comprehension skills. That becomes a bit more significant later down the line, where they start to ask their own questions as well in their heads. They also felt that the act from reading aloud to a class from a challenging text may support the development of the children's spoken language comprehension. And that this then in turn will contribute to their overall reading comprehension skills further down the line. But the talk time must come first. I think within this third strand here as well, we need to consider actually that by exposing them to more challenging reading material and reading it aloud to them that's beyond their decoding capability, that we're extending that vocabulary. We're exposing them to vocabulary that they wouldn't ordinarily draw on within spoken language between each other. That tier 2 kind of language that we've talked about with vocabulary instruction. So let's have a look at Kate Cain and Jane Oakhill. Now this is back in 2012, but actually it's still really relevant. Now Kate Cain and Jane Oakhill actually referred back to the simple view of reading. They went from this as a means for their study. And what they wanted to find out was whether the phonic instruction and the language comprehension, what kind of impact it had through the children's schooling. I think it was roughly in about year 3 and year 6. So by the age of 7, what did they notice? By the age of 11, what did they notice? What they did find actually after the investigation was that in those early stages, we have to really home in on the word reading. So that's your phonic teaching, quite apparent. That systematic system is quite dominant in that early education, in the development of that early reader. That's not forgetting the reading comprehension, but that is done more so by reading aloud to the children. What they found with that is in those early stages of development, both the word reading and the language and the reading aloud to them had an impact on their comprehension at the age of 7. But as the child went through the schooling, the ability to word read, it doesn't fall off the radar, but it doesn't need as much focus because they've cracked the code. And once they've cracked that code and they can keep it, it will remain at a high standard. Once you know the skill of decoding and blending, you've got that skill going from left to right. But actually what they found was that reading comprehension, that has to carry on almost like a continuum, okay? It's a much lengthier process to develop a learner's reading comprehension, because the more books they read, they're going to be exposed to vocabulary that they're not very familiar with. So this one here, reading aloud to them, sharing books, that's got to continue. So whilst the phonic teaching might slow down, and once they've cracked their code, they get to the end of the system, This one here has a significant contribution throughout our schooling period of time. As it says here, the development of word reading skills is time limited and typically secured within the first few years of teaching. Vocabulary knowledge, verbal reasoning, inference, comprehension monitoring, and knowledge and understanding of story structure were very important skills that must be developed further. They've got to keep on going. So I'd like you to think about what that means for you as practitioners. Think about the setting that you're currently working in, whether that's with adults, teenagers, young children. It might be learners that have got English as a learning language. Thinking of those areas there with word reading and language comprehension, what does that mean for you? How will it impact your practice? How are we getting the breadth of study for the learners within your setting? Just take a couple of minutes to jot down your reflections. Once they've cracked the code, do we stop reading aloud to them because they can read it themselves? Something to ask. The answer is, of course, no. But yeah, I'll go into that in a bit more detail. So as I've said, we must ensure that we continue to read aloud to our pupils. It shouldn't stop just because they've then cracked the code independently and they can read independently. Because we need to continue that language comprehension learning. Now, reading aloud to our pupils has a number of impacts, okay? Reading is a cultural and social act. It's important because it builds relationships, which I'm showing you here at the top. It's several relationships, actually, when we pick up a book. There's the relationship between the reader, between the text and the person who actually wrote it in the first place. And then also the social and cultural perspectives that you can explore when you open up a book. Lives that we wouldn't know anything about, or communities that we wouldn't know anything about, or issues, unless we read it. The act of deriving meaning from the communicative acts of others. So those relationships are critical. Now, it has a huge impact, a positive impact, because by being exposed to a wide range of literature, learners develop a depth of knowledge that supports them to comprehend. Once they start to read more and you get hooked in, you've connected with that text, it's giving that motivation, that release of dopamine to want to read more widely themselves. The more we can expose them to, as teachers, as leaders, the more that they will want to do it themselves, because we're opening up a world for them and they will be able to go on to open it up for themselves. But it is down to us as practitioners to start developing that reading habit. Okay? I need to read that because it's very small. If we want to develop the reader's capabilities, we need to create that reading community. We want them to have that motivation. We want them to develop a love of reading. Regardless of what experiences we've had with reading, that's our purpose here. But we have to develop the habit. So reading to people once a week is not going to have that desired impact. It needs to be done regularly and it needs to be done often. So what I'd like you to think about is how you at the moment have developed a bit of a reading habit in your setting. Whether you teach young children or adults, what do you do to engage your learners in story? Take a few minutes to reflect. This doesn't necessarily mean like a reading corner. It's about the habit of reading. So what do you do throughout the week to develop that habit? Just take a couple of minutes for that reflection. Is it that you read to them daily? Have you got a favourite author that you repeatedly share with your learners? Or do you introduce them to a range of stories? They might not be your favourite, but do you introduce them to those modern authors? Do you share traditional tales? Do we often revert back to the same author? Or are we giving them that breadth of language and style? Do they share books with you? Have a think. So what I'd like us to do is to have a little look at some work by a lady called Professor Teresa Creming, fabulous practitioner. She's professor at the Open University. And we met recently, actually, to look at the reading habit. She's really unpicked it. Fabulous. So she's produced a report called Reading Communities, Why, What and How. And I really recommend that you have a look at that article that she's put together. Now, she's looked within that report at the long-term aims, okay? The long-term aims versus practitioners in developing lifelong readers. She says the following: reading for pleasure has myriad other benefits, such as wider vocabulary and general knowledge, an enriched imagination, and more developed narrative writing. In more recent years, not before then, it's quite strange really, only in recent years have people begun to realise that developing a love of reading is actually, it's recognised as essential. And in more recent years, yet again, there is more international evidence coming forward, okay, that reading for pleasure can actually be a predictor of a reader's attainment. They actually found in recent study that those that are less enthralled by reading, and they say, I hate reading, I think it was something like 45 marks less in attainment by the age of 11, as opposed to those that feel that they've got independent choice and they're part of a reading community within their school. Really interesting work. So, what does the research tell us? They carried out a study, and they looked at this study. It was called Teachers as Readers, because they wanted to establish the behaviours of the practitioner and then the impact on said children. This study was carried out across 27 schools, 43 teachers, and 5 different areas of England, 5 different, very different in demographic as well. So they did look at some of the most disadvantaged areas. So what did the research tell us? What did they find? It was found that they could develop strong reading communities when teachers widened their own knowledge of literature. As I said before, quite often, I went into a room recently, actually, into a school, fabulous setting, but the teacher always reverted to Julia Donaldson. Now, whilst I did one on Julia Donaldson last week, actually, while she's a fabulous author, we need to widen our knowledge of it. So I asked, where do you get your inspiration? Now, that was her comfort zone. So she regularly read to the children. But as we know with many of Julia Donaldson pieces, they're very similar in structure. They've always got a moral to the story. But actually, there's many authors out there that we want to introduce the children to. So those reading communities, for a child that doesn't like Julia Donaldson, it's very rare, but when they do exist, we're actually disengaging them straight away. And we need to reach out to them. We need to grab them in. So those stronger communities were developed when the teacher widened their knowledge and pleasure in reading children's literature. And my first advice to her, to be honest, was to go to a bookshop and sit and just sift through the material. Sit and read the books that you come from and see what other magical text you can find. She came back very excited and she spent an awful lot of money, but it worked. Because once she'd got a bigger range in her repertoire, that meant that the children did too. Strong reading communities were also developed when they became more aware of their own preferences. So what do you enjoy as a reader? And then becoming more aware of the children's reading preferences. Have you got a range of non-fiction? Do you read and share a range of poetry? It became stronger when they got to know the interests of their young readers. What makes them tick? What excites them? And also, even stronger a reading community when the teachers became more open to receiving suggestions from their children, from their learners. Now, by doing all of these things here, they enable discussions and live connections. They enabled new relationships to begin within that setting because children started to make connections with each other. So Charlie and Jake that loved a graphic novel, they didn't know that each of them loved graphic novels until these discussions took place. So sitting together and really talking about what they enjoy. So I'm going to share with you now some of the work that some of the practitioners did within these schools to create their reading community. And as I said before, it wasn't about having a sparkly book corner. It was about really seeing themselves as readers, not just displaying on the door your latest book, but getting to know the pattern of your reading. And I really liked some of the things that we found. This one here, pretty straightforward actually. So the teacher created her own mini library and she brought books in from home that she'd read. Some of these were shared with the children out loud, reading aloud to them. But then at other times, children would go and access them themselves. They took quite pride in that really because the fact that it was Mrs. Book made it a little bit more exciting. Over time, once this had developed further, children would give her recommendations. And she started to add to this library. And then you can see up here, I know it's quite small, but there's reading recommendations. So the children might just list something that they read at the weekend with family, or something that they'd seen on a bookshelf in the library or in the local shop. Now here, this one here was about getting to know the preferences and getting to identify herself as a reader and her pupil. That it wasn't just about reading a book, but that we're reading all of the time. So she did a bit of a 24-hour reading map of different things. And she took posts and stuck them on. So if she'd read an article in a magazine, that went on the board. Certain labels that she'd seen, she made a quick note of them, stuck them on that board. Book that she was reading before going to bed, she put it on the board. A menu in a local restaurant, she put it on the board so that she could see her habits. What she did then was actually encourage the children to do exactly the same because they were identifying when and how they were reading. But by all of them creating it, she started to identify things that the children enjoy and she could then home in on that during the shared reading time. So the fact that some of the children particularly liked poetry became evident, she would then ensure that she's covering it. This one here was even more beautiful in a way, really, and it was a reading river. So this one, rather than being over a 24-hour period of time, it was all in a chronological order, but she just linked it in order. So you could do this over the course of a couple of weeks and create it. What the teacher noticed then was actually that she was reading the same kind of stuff all the time as well. It's a bit like me. I love historical fiction that would appear regularly and probably work articles, to be honest. But it made me realise that I was actually narrowing my opportunities. So if I was doing that with my own, was I doing it with the children? So she created a reading river, and then this pupil here, as you can see, created their own reading river. Now, this could build over time, because if you do it at different intervals a few months down the line, you might see a bigger range of material included. Because the teacher's reading river changed as she started to introduce a wider range of literature to the children as well. And so did theirs. It expanded their river, made it larger. So why have I shared that with you? Now, reading for pleasure is a big one. It's a big buzzword at the moment. It's always been there, but it's higher profile. Now they realise the impact that it actually has. And it's down to us to create our own reading community, our own reading for pleasure pedagogy. Now, within that community, within that pedagogy, we've got to make sure that we've planned time for reading. We fully encompass it. When is that reading going to take place? How long for? How frequently during the week? Thinking about, when do we want the children to do independent reading? When are we going to read aloud to them? When are we going to just sit and talk about the stories that we're sharing? When am I going to allow time for those recommendations? Is it just going to be scribbling down quickly? Or are we going to let people bring those recommendations in and choose our top 5? But all the while, any of these practices here, independent reading, book talk, recommendation, they've got to be known what we call RIST. That's reader-led. They must be informal. We're not assessing them, we're just sharing that story. It needs to be a social activity. And above all, we want it to be with texts that tempt them. So what I'd like you to do is just think about your own reading community at the moment. How do you tempt your pupils? How do you engage them in your own setting? And just make a few notes. Like Teresa says here, developing children's desire to read is a subtle process. We cannot demand that they find pleasure in a particular text, especially if we like it. But we can entice them, and we can engage them as readers and create those relaxed invitation spaces for reading. So how do you do that with your learners? How do you engage them? What texts do you share with them? Do you have your own reading library already? Now, the reason I've asked you to reflect on that, as in, do you have your own reading library? Do you have that environment? Is because the reality of the situation is that many children do not choose to read at home. The research is out there, the statistics are out there. Many of the children that come into our care, they're not read to by an adult at home. And that can be because of a number of reasons, really. I've worked in school settings where the children weren't read to, they weren't listened to read. And when we actually unpicked it further, that was because the adults in that home had not yet cracked the code themselves. They were not readers. They did not know how to read. Other areas of my work, we work demographically in high deprivation area. So some of these children and these families, although we'd love to have this image here, they don't have access to the reading material that we would want them to have access to. Or if they do, at times it's very little. We've got to think of that context. The other one as well to think about contextually is that some may have a very negative attitude towards reading. And that again will be down to their experiences before coming into your classroom. So when we think about that, we've got a duty really to ensure, okay, that we're setting aside that time for reading. I'm just going to refer to something that was shared with me that struck a bit of a chord. So thinking of those children, sustained time in school needs to be set aside for reading alone, reading with others, for hearing those narratives, for hearing poetry and sharing non-fiction, and for book talk. Think about that book talk and think about those recommendations. What do our children want to read about? So what I'd like you to do is take a little bit of time, just a couple of minutes, as to why you think, well, what is storytelling and why is it so important? Try and define that for me. I will share the actual definition as well, but have a go yourselves. So what is storytelling and why is it so important? Okay, storytelling. Stories have been used to hand down learning and knowledge for thousands of years. A good story engages our curiosity, our emotions, and our imagination. The transformative power of storytelling has a huge potential to bring about change. Why is it so important? Because once we can read, we open up so many other areas of opportunity. We can teach through story. If we think of in the workplace, story could be used for analysis, retelling an incident that might have happened, not just about the narratives that are on the page. We tell story all of the time. So, what is the actual art of storytelling? What's the first thing that springs to mind when you think of storytelling? Do you have a childhood memory? A story that maybe you've shared with your own children or with children in your class? Did people read to you when you were younger? What was that experience like? Did you have a teacher that used to share stories and make it that really special time of day? When you think about that storytelling, what were the conditions like that you were told them in? Were you all sat comfortably? Were you snuggled down? Think about those different situations where you might be read to. And then think about things like, were there different voices for different characters? How did it feel when you were being read to? Because stories are the way we understand and make sense of the world we find ourselves in. Now, if I refer here to this fabulous lady, Claire Patey, I think it's pronounced, she talks about storytelling. It does not just take place within a pool of lamplight in a nursery or around a campfire. Stories are part of our daily lives, in the anecdotes that we tell friends, the books that we read and the films that we watch. Stories are also recognised as a way of connecting with any audience, and it's used increasingly in workplaces, in advertising and fundraising. As she said here, stories are the way we understand and make sense of the world that we find ourselves in. Now, stories, as we said earlier, they can take many different forms. Now, they usually have some elements in common. Rather than a list of dry facts just to learn from, within a story, we've got that narrative, we've got that sequence. They introduce people who we can connect with. They introduce characters that we can home in on and understand a bit more. We connect and we respond to stories, and we can remember the information that's being given to us a lot more vividly when it's been done in story form. And that's why we use it. That's why we use rhymes and mnemonics to teach a sound or a letter or a word. We can connect to that story. Stories are critical. They allow us to see, to share, to learn, to make connections, and they grab our attention. They allow us to see the world in a different way, to share the different experiences of the world, to learn from each other's experiences, to make those connections. And when a story catches our attention and engages us, we're much more likely to absorb the message or the meaning behind it. Now, everybody, they've got stories to tell, but storytelling in itself has got quite an art. It's got quite an art form. It's a skill that does need mastering. I'll tell a story and he won't mind me sharing. I worked with a colleague, Matt, and I'd introduced the revamped story time in our school. We worked in a really large primary school. We had about 650 children, which for the UK is pretty large in school sizes. So each year group had 90. Now, Matt was a fantastic teacher, absolutely top drawer. He predominantly taught the older children, so they were 10, 11. And at that time, I'd recently been in year 10 and age 10 and 11. And then I moved down to lower key stage 1. So they're 5, they're 6 years of age. And I loved storytelling. But when I think of my storytelling experience as a child, my mum read to me every single night before bed. So although she worked full time and I didn't see her much in the day, story time was never forgotten. It was a really special time of day. So introducing this new method of reading that we were doing with the children in school, for me, was really straightforward because I'd had so many experiences of being read to. And I had this idea that actually we would do something called a reading robin. So the idea was that teachers would rotate rooms. So I'd sound a bell and then all of the teachers would switch rooms. So year 4 teachers might go down to reception, and then the children would wait in anticipation to see who their storyteller was going to be that day. I went into Matt's room and I'd put him down. So he was a year 6 teacher and I put him down to go down to year 1. And he went grey. It's like, I can't even, it just made him agitated. One, I think he was slightly frightened of the much smaller children because they tend to swarm around you. But also it was using the voices, engaging them, hooking the suspense and pausing it at the end of each page. He felt much more comfortable doing it with the older children. And I think what Matt had missed when we got unpicking it further, as a child, he hadn't had that storytelling experience. His parents rarely read to him. So he had nobody to role model on when he was then doing it with his class. So basically I threw him in at the deep end and I sent him to year 1. But in the run up to going down to year 1, he practiced. So we would sit, you have to build a lot of trust with this. We would sit and he would start to tell us the story. And one of my other colleagues would just switch off if he wasn't doing the voices or he was rushing through too quickly. Almost like an art of coaching with him, really. And that worked really well. But it is an art. It is a performance in a way. And it's not just a case of, let's scoop the book up and let's just start reading without doing the groundwork first. What we do beforehand is absolutely critical. Now, If we develop our skill and we practice that art form and we use storytelling purposefully, we can ensure that we include those children, we can connect with them, we can build their confidence, and potentially you're going to bring about change because you've communicated a message really clearly. So before we go on to that technique, and I am going to share one with you with my limited space in the dining room, I want us to think about something else that's crucial before we start that story time. We need to make sure that we choose the right books. Have a little read of that quote by Marianne Wolfe. It's crucial because we know that emotional engagement is the tipping point between leaping into a reading life or remaining in that childhood bog where reading is endured as a means to an end. Like, is my reading time over yet? I'm done with this. We choose the right books, that's not going to be the case. So let's take a look, okay? Let's take a look at the reading material that we share with our learners. Does it have the following? Does it elicit a response from them? And that response can be any of those things. It could be that we make them feel more curious. It could anger them. I think it was Skellig. There were parts in there and I got a little bit angry. But that's good. We want to elicit any of these responses. Does it make them excited? Do they enjoy it? Does it make you laugh? Does it interest them? I think with the amusement one, that's always a good starting point. I think it was the World's Worst Children, David Walliams. I've read all of his material with any number of classes, but the children could connect with it and it really did make them chuckle. Again, does it have that strong narrative structure or is it really poor? Not every time, but occasionally it would be nice if it extends their vocabulary, but not too many new words in one go. We don't want to overwhelm them so that they can't comprehend what's going on. Does it connect with something that they already know about? Is it a scenario that they might have been in? Have they seen other books by that author? Does it have illustration? Not always critical, but there are some really good modern fiction picture books that really intrigue, that you can talk about and infer. Now, the next model that I'm going to share with you is a strategy, and this is the storytelling strategy. I've drawn on it many times, and there is method behind my madness. Years ago, I looked at using Shakespeare with Key Stage 2 children. And I was determined, I was always a fan. I used to love going to the RSC to watch Shakespeare, and I loved The Tempest. And I wanted my year fives to love The Tempest because it's quite a passionate piece. And I started looking online and I found a training course in Stratford about bringing Shakespeare to younger children. And one of the ladies on this demo, so it's about 14 years ago, 14, she shared with me something called whoosh. Quite often at university, they would talk about using drama. Now, being a stage performer, I'd got a real issue with that because my theory is this. You're putting an awful lot of pressure on the children if they're not confident to perform in front of other people. So I got chatting about that with this lady. So the idea of hot seating, fantastic. But also, if you've got somebody who's particularly shy, that would just spread fear through them. And I didn't want that with the children. I wanted them to be fully immersed from the offset. And she introduced me to the word whoosh, which I'm going to demo for you in just a minute. Now, the goal with this whoosh story circle, I'm just going to move that back a little bit so it's clearer. The goal with this whoosh story circle is that actually On the very first introduction of whatever text, I won't be doing that one, whatever text that you're doing, it can be any, that the children are fully immersed from the very beginning. So this would be like a day one kind of strategy. If we think back to one of those earlier slides where I shared they just read it all without stopping, or they ask questions, this is kind of that middle ground entry that I talked about. Now, this method of this story circle, we're going to bring it to life, and we're going to bring it to life so that the children can see it, they can hear it, in part they can say it, and also they're physically participating. We're making all of the events of that story more concrete, okay? The other thing with this is that there is no expectation for them to improvise anything, because you're going to act not only as narrator, but also like a little bit of a director as well. So I'm going to have to draw a diagram first. Ordinarily, with this model, I would demo with a group of 30 children, but I don't have access to those because obviously we're locked down. So I'm going to demonstrate as best as I can. Now, within your class, this works with any number, doesn't matter how large the group is or how small. The idea would be, just very quickly, that around the edge here, I'm not very artistic. Let me just stop that slide and then I can show you more clearly. So the idea would be that around the circle, these are our little people. And then here is the teacher with the new book. So I'm just going to draw a little picture of the book. Now you've already done the introduction of the title, and I think I've read one like this before. We're going to start reading the story. Now the idea with this is that we gather participants into the centre of the circle. It's like Shakespeare in the round, it's great. But we have to invite them. So the teacher starts to read the story, and they would tap somebody on the shoulder and invite them to enter the circle. All the other children at this point are spectator. It could be that we're inviting one of the spectators to be the central character. So I'll do Jack and the Beanstalk today. Good old favourite. So I invite Jack to the circle. I invite the cow to the circle. Then I might say, oh, and you two, and these two here are going to be the ark of the cottage, okay? So I start the story, I will demo, don't worry, and we invite them in. But we're directing them as to what we want them to do. You tell them where to stand. You tell them what they should be doing. All the while, you're still reading the story. And it's done really nicely. You can plot the first couple of times, you might want to plot it. You're moving around. Now, after a while, if that circle within here gets a little bit busy, we're not going to keep these same 4 children for the whole story. We would stop, shout whoosh, and they go back to their original seated position. Then as you move on with the plot, you tap somebody new on the shoulder to enter. And again, we're directing them as to exactly what we want them to do whilst we read the story aloud. So the children are hearing your voice, they're seeing the action take place. Or if they're in the action, they're feeling it take place. Now, by the end of the story, ideally, you want every child to have had a turn at some point, so that they're not going away and 27 of the children have stepped in, whether it's to be a tree or a rock or the old man seller in the market. They've all had a go at being in the circle. I can pretty much guarantee with this model that their recall of those events will be much, much clearer and in sequence. because we've hit every area. They've seen it, they've felt it, they've heard it. All the while, you're the narrator and director, rolled into one. So what I'll do, I'll give a couple of examples. It's a bit tricky because obviously I've got no children. Should have thought of that really before I started, but never mind. So we introduce the story. So just imagine I've got a load of children and I will give a bit of a demo. And where I pause, that would be the children responding, we hope. Standing up. Move that back. Once upon a time, there was a boy named Jack who lived in a small cottage with his mother. Right, Charlie, can you come in? I'd like you to be Jack. So you stand here and you bring the child in. Alicia, can you be his mother? So his mum's taller, Jack's smaller. So Charlie, can you just crouch down a little bit? Perfect. So once upon a time, there was a boy named Jack who lived in a small cottage with his mother. You're pointing at the two. The only possession they had in the world was a cow named Milky White. Right, I need two children to be the cow. So you go around and you tap, I'll take you and I'll take you. It's not an option, you just invite and bring them in. Right, can you stand there for me? Now, Milky White, they sold his milk at the market. But one day, Milky White stopped giving milk. And Jack's mother, this one here, told him to sell the cow so that they could get money for food. She said to him, Jack, I want you to sell our cow. Can you say that? And then the child joins in. Now, you'll see in here, she doesn't say that at all. I've added that little bit of lib in, but it works because, again, we're then getting them to speak, but we're not asking them to devise dialogue. We're giving it to them. The next morning, Jack woke up. Can you wake up for me? That's it, big stretch. So you're telling them the actions. And then on the way to the market, right, Charlie, walk to the market lead the cow with you. On the way to the market, Jack met a strange old man. Right, who can be my strange old man? Do you want to come in? How would the old man stand, do you think? Let's lean slightly forward. So you're telling them exactly how to do it. And he proposed a swap. To swap Milky White the cow for a handful of beans. Can you show us your handful of beans? And the child produces. So all the while we're directing. We invite them how to stand, how to move, direct them round. Now, the more you do that, the easier it definitely gets. Now, what I would generally do, so there's dialogue here as well. So he's proposed a handful of beans. But they're not just any beans, the old man told Jack. Can you tell him? They're not just any beans. The child does it. They're not just any beans, the old man told Jack. They're magic. Big voice, show us. They're magic. And they imitate you. Jack knew that he had to have them. He said, I've got to have those. Whisper it to yourself. I've got to have those. If they don't grow, the old man said, if they don't grow, I'll give you your cow back. That's it. You tell him, point your finger. I'll give you your cow back. And we will throw in a free bag of cow manure just for your trouble. Well, that sealed the deal. They made their exchange. How can you make your exchange, you two? That's it. You two shake hands. The children shake hands. Now, by this point then, I've done 2 pages, and that would be an ideal interval to shout whoosh. The children go back to the edge of their circle, and then I start to invite the next ones in. I do apologise, my dog is really barking. I think somebody's come to the door, so just bear with. Yeah. So they've had their turn and they return to the edge of the circle. Then you as narrator, if you need to, you might reread a little bit of that, but then you just carry on with the flow of the story. And the next time you choose a different Jack, you choose a different cow, you choose a different old man, so that they're all having their go. Now, the joy with that one, if you've got children who are really shy, they might not want to talk. So you might select, don't overthink it, but you might select certain children and you do it that they don't have to speak because they're not comfortable talking in front of their peers. If they are, let them go for it. Give them the cue, tell them what to say. If they're not dramatic enough, encourage it a little bit more. Try that again. And it's all physical as well. So if he's walking to market, right, can you show us walking to the market? And they're walking around the circle. It's a really lovely model. And I have to say, it works with any narrative. I've used it hundreds and hundreds of times. I'm yet to come across a book that it doesn't work with. Now, as I said before, the ideal model would be that I would do that with lots of children in the room, but we don't have. So, yeah, give it a go. It's amazing. I've done it with any. And the other good thing about it is I've done it with any age range of children and younger adults that are not yet confident. So it might not necessarily be with a full narrative, a full text with older children, but I've done it with particular chapters that I want to explore with them because they've got themes through, that kind of thing. So I would use that whoosh story circle, as I call it, to hook them in the first instance. And then in the second session, we'd then be looking to see their recall. What can they remember? What were those key events? What happened and when? Can we order them before we explore it a little bit further? I'm just going to go back to our slides. So that, excuse me, was the whoosh story circle in a nutshell. Give it a go. You will find your own kind of style and become more comfortable. The more you do it, the easier it gets. And I think one of the biggest things is that we don't rush it. Don't rush it through. Just take your time. You've got a whole session to immerse them in that text. It's quality story time. So, thinking about the strategies that I used then in my very mini demo in the dining room, we'd got the teacher, not only as the narrator reading, but also as a little bit of a director, telling them exactly what to do and where to stand, how to move. Show me how the man would stand. Other strategies, we've enabled the children to see, to hear, and to feel that narrative. Their recall will vastly improve because we're hitting all of those areas. They're more likely to remember the key events because their friends were doing them right in front of them. Yeah, they were acting it out. The techniques with that, it is drama, but they don't need to be a drama expert and be hot-seated and answer questions on the spot in the first instance, or be an actress or an actor, because it's in that safe environment with you fully supporting that entire process. So they're like non-threatening drama techniques. We've created that full experience and it's concrete for them. And they're making connection. Because their friend is currently acting as the mum in the one part, they've made the connection between the actions of their friend and the character in the book. We've also retained their attention. They absolutely love it. And they will giggle, they will laugh, and that is absolutely fine. Let them. Pause, go back to it. So what I would like you to think about is, we've done it previously as well, but what does your own practice look like? Is this something that you could use with your learners in your setting? Were there any strategies that you thought, yes, I like this model. It's not complicated, it's a simple model, but it works. Could I give it a go with mine? Again, any age range at all. And if you could use those strategies, when might you use them? How often? On average, I used to use that particular strategy every couple of weeks. Anymore, and it kind of got a little bit diluted and it didn't hook them in the same way. But particularly if we're doing a text over a course of a few weeks, it was perfect, really. And think about the research that I shared with you. How did it inform my model of bringing that story to life? Did I create a reading community by using that whoosh story circle? So think about how you could use it with your own learners. How could you use it? And then what are you going to do after today's session? And before you go, I will hang around for a little while afterwards. So if you've got, I noticed somebody popped something into the chat here before. If you've got any questions, I'll hang around for about 10 minutes or so, on 10 to 15 minutes on the chats here. I'll answer any questions. But before I leave you, thank you very much for listening in. And I'm just going to share with you this quote. The books that we live through together for the sole purpose of shared enjoyment represent a rich resource for conversation, for connection, and for spinning webs of readers' relationships. So thank you very much. Right, I'll stop that slide. And I will stay around in the chat for a little while. So if you do have any questions, feel free to fire them my way. Apologies about the dog. If anybody comes to the front door, she just joins right in. My pleasure. Oh, that's a lovely definition of story. My pleasure. That's lovely. Oh. Ah, yes, I remember.